Hi, I'm Dan. Thanks for checking in on Dimgaard this week. So this week we're going to take a look at scaling encounters. It was a topic that was suggested to me and one that was thought to be useful, and I can agree with that. And one that's not being touched upon anywhere else. So I scale every single encounter to some degree, right? And it's a hugely important part of being an effective DM, at least if your goal is collaborative story building. So first, we're gonna lay some foundational elements. Then we're going to go into the underlying structure of scaling encounters in 5th edition. Then I'm going to talk about some specific techniques for scaling in 5th edition. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with going into a little bit of the history of scaling encounters. So the first thing we need to do is establish the definition of scaling. We're talking about the same thing here. And what I'm talking about with scaling encounters is you have the same encounter, right? So it's the same locations, serves the same plot point, has the same population of people and of creatures involved in it. But we're going to change elements of it in response to the level of the PCs, in response to the number of PCs in the party, and in response to the type of PCs that we have in the party. And then that's what we mean by scaling, right? And then the question becomes, why do we even need to scale, right? And the fact is, if you are creating your own content, like if you're building your own encounters, building your own stories, your own adventures for a group that you know well, right? So the players are the same PCs that are there every week for you. Then probably you don't need to worry too much about scaling. But that is so rarely the case these days, right? There are just don't, like, I don't know, well over 90% of the groups who are playing 5th edition have some volatility in the PC mix. And in those cases, you want your adventure, which is then going to be the counters are the building block of adventures. You want those to be appropriate for a wide range of PCs, right? You don't want it to be really narrowly focused. You want to have PCs of as wide a range of levels as possible, as wide a range of the party size as possible, and as wide a range of combat optimization as possible. And so to do that, 5th edition did a very diligent job of explaining in the rule set what scaling is and how to scale. And this is addressed in the DMG from pages 82 to 86, 85. And whenever I looked at that, like 2016, 2015, whenever it was, 5th edition, 2015, I thought it was fantastic, right? But then, I have a degree in math and tend to be a little on the nerdy math side, right? And objectively, if you're not of that inclination, yeah, I can see why it was not widely used, right? Because like the structure of it within the DMG is very complicated mathematically, right? For like anyone who's not mathematically inclined, you are using multiply chosen elements, mathematical elements, to then derive other mathematical elements to then arrive at a qualitative decision, right? So you start, you have the number of PCs, the level of the PCs, that then you use that to calculate the XP budget, which you then adjust based upon the number of PCs and the number of opponents. And then you take an evaluative look at the end and say, yeah, what is going to be the resource depletion and the threat level that's going to be the result of this encounter for most parties, right? And so, yeah, I can understand why even like the published WotC hardback adventures ignore that. They just sort of take a best look at it, like, yeah, well, 5th level PCs, they should be confronting like CR1 and 2 creatures. We'll just go from there to put what we think is a good mix and call it a day. But I can tell you that if you are mathematically inclined and are able to authentically go through that process, and you also enforce the adventuring day, which is a whole other thing, right? Like no one outside of Dimgaard consistently follows the adventuring day, but that is a premise of the entire encounter building process in the 5th edition DMG. Then it is valid. Like it is valid. Like I can just tell you, like in the games I run, the Dimgaard games that I run, we do 6 to 8 medium to hard encounters. By the time we get to 5, 6, and 7, we are usually seeing PC deaths, not TPKs, but and not things that can't be addressed with Revivify and things like that. But it's definitely we very validly construct our encounters to be medium encounters. So with that consideration, so that was the first shot 5th edition produced at a methodology of constructing encounters. And then, by Xanathars, they're like, okay, that's not working, right? It's just a fact, it's not working, which I give them a great deal of credit for recognizing, oh, this isn't working. So Xanathar says, we're going to address that, right? And then, so you go into Xanathars and you take a look at, I think it's 88 to 91. And we have a much more cogent, direct methodology for scaling encounters, right? And it's like, okay, your PCs are this level, you have this many PCs, this is the single opponent they should face, CR blah, right? Or it's like, well, you don't want a single opponent. All right, then you have this many PCs and they're this level, then you should have this many creatures of this CR for the encounter. So if you have 3 5th level PCs and you want CR2 creatures, then that's 3, 1 per PC. If you want CR1s, that's 2 per PC. That's 6 if you've got a party of 3, right? Much quicker, much direct. And I will tell you that I have done the math underlying Xanathars. And while sometimes if you do the math, you end up with a slightly easier encounter than you were expecting, and sometimes you end up with a slightly harder encounter, but really it does a very good job of following or correlating to the process that is overly detailed in the DMG, pages 82 to 85. So that to get to, if you are like, if you're wanting a really quick and easy way to scale the encounters, you just set up your base encounter. And then if you're like, oh, wait, this is not the party mix I was expecting, just have your Xanathars handy right there, and you can make those adjustments on the fly. It's like, oh, I've got an extra 7th level PC. Okay, so that's an extra CR3 creature in the mix, right? In this encounter, right? Whatever the particular index and entry lines to in Xanathar, and you're going to be in good shape as far as scaling goes. As far as scaling to the level of the PCs and the number of creatures. Where we run into a problem, even with Xanathars, is if we want to have a single creature and we want to set that up, be prepared for the party, but we don't know what the party mix is going to be, the number of PCs or the level of the PCs. Because Xanathar says, okay, if you're facing a single PC, or if the PCs are facing a single creature, here's the CR. But what if you need to change that? Like it's not going to, like, you cannot substitute just a random CR3 for a random CR4 creature and have the same story going on in the encounter, right? They're not those creatures with those particular CRs may not be interchangeable, right? I mean, sure, sometimes it is like, oh, well, I started with a bandit captain and now, oh, I'm supposed to have a veteran, a CR3. So I'll go from the CR2 bandit captain to the CR3 veteran. Like, oh, wait, I need to now go up to a CR4. What's a CR4? I guess maybe like a hobgoblin captain or orc war chief instead. Then CR5, you got gladiator. So sometimes when you look at creatures, you can say, oh no, I can find a creature that aligns to these CRs and scale up the single creature accordingly. But a lot of times you can't, right? It's like, oh, this is, I had plopped down this single CR5 air elemental, but now according to Xanathars, I need to take it up to a CR6. And like, so what do you do? All right, so the mechanics of scaling for a single creature encounter. If we look in the DMG on page 274, right, it has the way to modify a CR, modify the CR of a creature on the fly, right? In particular, we want to be in a situation where we start with a base creature, say a CR3 creature, and then we say, okay, we're going to need to be able to scale that up incrementally, right? So it's like, oh, okay, I thought I was going to have 3 PCs, so I started with this CR3 creature, and now I need, but instead I've got 5 PCs, so I need to scale that up from a CR3 creature to a CR5 creature, right? How do we do that? And page 274 does that. So the way you do that is you can just on the fly, right? So there are 4 elements that we can manipulate, that we can increase, and by certain increments are going to increase the CR of the underlying creature. In particular, if we increase 2 of these elements by 1 increment, then we increase the CR of the underlying creature by 1. So those 4 elements are its overall hit points, and the increment on that is generally going to be 15 hit points, right? So if you're below CR 1/2 or you're above like CR 22, I think it changes. Maybe it's CR 20. I don't know. At some point it gets bigger on the other side, but in general, in most of the CR ranges we're looking at, if you're like, oh, I need to increase this creature's CR on the fly because I've got more PCs for this single creature encounter than I was expecting. So increasing the hit points by 15 is an increment. Increasing the armor class by 2 is an increment. Increasing its attack bonus by 2 is an increment, or increasing its damage per round is an increment, right? So if you needed to increase a creature's a CR5 to a CR6 for this single creature encounter that you're doing, what you can do is say, oh, okay, I need to go from a 5 to a 6. I'll give him 15 extra hit points and give him an extra +2 to attack. So if he was +6 to attacks before, now he's +8 to attack, and now he's going to be a CR6, right? Needed to increase it another more, then you say, oh, okay, then I'm going to, in addition to the +2 and the +15 hit points, I'm going to go ahead and raise his armor class too. I'll give him the equivalent of a toughened hide or better armor or something like that, and I am going to increase his damage. So I'm going to give him the equivalent of some sort of a martial advantage modifier, so that I increase his damage by 6, as well as his attack bonus. And then you can scale them up by that. That's on the fly, just like boom. I needed him to have a higher CR. Boom, increase 2 of these 4 elements by these increments, and I'm going to increase the CR by that. Now, if you are inclined, and this is what we do in Dimgaard, you can plan for this. And the way that we plan for that is we look at what a base creature would be for the single creature, and then we are going to be increasing that incrementally from that base creature. So, for example, if you were 1 5th level PC and you were facing 1 opponent, right? The scaling model would call for you to be facing a CR2 creature. Right? If you were 2 5th level PCs, right, and you were facing a single creature, the model would call for that to be a CR3 creature, right? And then you can look all the way up, and you will see that if there were 7 5th level PCs and they were facing one, they would be facing a CR7 creature. So you say, oh, that's pretty easy. It's going to be 1 plus the number of PCs. So then what we do is we start with a CR1 creature, right? And then we start adding on those increments from that base. So for 1 PC, so we start with a CR1 creature. You say, well, there's 1 PC. All right, we're going to have an effect, right? Maybe a trait, maybe an aura, maybe some sort of a mechanism that's going to come in and do this for the creature. But we're going to start with CR1, and against 1 PC, we're going to have an effect that increases his hit points and his damage per round by 6, right? So something that's going to damage that HPC by 6, right? And something that's going to give him 15 extra hit points for each PC that he's facing. And then because of that, it's going to scale up to what we need. But like I say, you don't have to do that. That's what Dimgaard does. But we tend to over prepare in Dimgaard. And if you're wanting to be like, okay, I just want to be able to do this on the fly, I don't want to have to put in a lot of effort up front to construct these elaborate mechanisms that are going to scale him, then yeah, just on the fly. I need to take him from a CR7 to a CR8, 15 extra hit points, and his damage, his attacks already do an average of 6 points of damage. So I'll increase his multi-attack by 1. So he goes from 2 to 3 attacks per round. And then he's got that extra 6 points of damage, right? So yeah, you can do that. Then we get into, so what we talked about so far is changing the number of creatures and how easy that is to do when we look at Xanathars. We have looked at what to do when we're facing a single creature and we need to adjust its CR on the fly. The next one is requires a little more finesse, a little more, and that is, what do you do about when the PCs do not have the level of optimization that is implied by the difficulty of the encounter, right? So this can go one of 2 ways. Like you could have an encounter that is looking to be hard, it's very clear from the context, this is supposed to be the hard encounter, and you've got a group of PCs who are just ready for the fight, man. They're just, you got your sharpshooters and your heavy weapon masters, and that one guy with the 26 AC and who can shield to 31 and impose disadvantage so that they can't be critted, right? And then you're like, okay, wow, this is never going to be a hard encounter with following the baseline guidelines, right? So what we can do is we can impose some environmental factors that will either make it harder or easier, right? Now on like, I'll just give you a good combination. We can put everything in darkness and give them dark vision, right? Or if all of the PCs have dark vision, okay, we'll put everything in magical darkness and give them devil's sight or blind sight or tremor sense or some way to see through the magical darkness. Now you're typically going to need an explanation for that, right? Like, and we try, or I definitely, if for the encounters that are critical to the plot, for the overarching plot, where I'm like, okay, this really needs to be a memorable, hard encounter. I'm going to put in elements in there that can be turned up or turned down as I need to. And that a lot of times that will be things like, oh, okay, they have devil's sight and they have darkness available to them. Now, if they don't need the darkness, if 3 hours into the session I've gotten the feel, it's like, no, this is going to be fine. This is going to be plenty hard, and we're good to go. Then, and I don't need to turn on the darkness plus devil's sight. Then fine, I don't, right? Or you could have, like, anywhere that the PCs are heading into foreign territory to engage in combat, you can drop a spell glyph down there, right? Like yeah, at the beginning of combat, boom, everyone is hit by dispel magic spell glyphs, followed immediately by hold person spell glyphs. And then you neutralize some of the PCs and make it hard. And you could have a poison cloud suddenly get dropped in. So there are all sorts of environmental things that if you need to toughen up the encounter, you can, right? That and like in the case of poison, so the bad guys, they have the equivalent of a periaptive of poison immunity, right? So they're immune to poison, and but the PCs are now all several of the PCs are poisoned, right? Like, there are all sorts of these types of it's really limited only by your imagination about how you can impose a condition on the PCs that's going to make it harder for them. And this is accounted for in the DMG. Like, the DMG says, yeah, if you need to increase the difficulty of an encounter by 1 increment, then you can add conditions that are going to affect the PCs in a definitely negative way and not going to affect the other part. Even things like surprise, like you can say, okay, the PCs are surprised, right? And then it can go the other way too, right? So if you realize 3 hours into it that these guys, they're not bad players, but they're not really combat oriented. They're not combat optimized. So you can soften it up by going the other direction on it. So you can make less optimal selections on spell choices than what is in the stat block. You can, so for example, if they have devil's sight and they have darkness available to them, you could decide that, oh, you know what, they've already used their darkness, their 1 time per day that they can cast darkness. It's not available to them, right? That's a completely valid thing to decide. On the fly, if you're in the middle of combat and you're realizing that, oh man, this is turning out to be too hard, you can just arbitrarily reduce the number of hit points that NPCs or monsters have remaining, right? They say, oh, you know what? I mean, like in the middle of combat, you could realize, oh, you know what? This is the third combat this monster's been in today, so he would not have come in here with full hit points. I'm gonna mark those down 15 hit points, whatever, reduce them by 15 and then to avoid a TPK or something like that, right? Or right, this happens a lot. If you have a situation where the PCs are not particularly combat focused, not optimized for that, likely there is going to be something else that they are optimized towards, and you can redirect the resolution of the combat from a fight to the death to whatever is more aligned with them. So if they're allow them, it's like in the middle of it and things are going badly for the PCs, allow a negotiation to occur, right? Talking is free during combat, and allow the PCs a way out without fighting to the death. So yeah, so those are ways to those are the mechanics for scaling combat or scaling combat encounters. And I think if you work, and it's a matter of practice, right? So no one's going to sit down tomorrow who's never done much scaling before and be a master at it, right? It is 100% a skill that, like all skills, improves with practice. And I think now, I mean, I may be wrong, but I think now if you were to talk to most of the players, they would not even realize the ad hoc scaling of encounters that occurs in my Dimgaard games, particularly when I'm playtesting, because a lot of times when I'm playtesting, one of the things that I'm working on is what the baseline encounter should look like, right? And it's very, very common that I will be in the middle of an encounter and I'm like, oh wow, this save is too high. The DC on this save is too high. It's affecting the party like way more severely than I was expecting it to. And then I will reduce the effect or end the effect. Maybe the effect has a limited duration instead of being an every round, whatever. But anyway, so yeah, it is a matter of determination and practice, and you do get more fluid with it, get more comfortable doing it as you come. I will say that, so what I have not included and what I have deliberately avoided, because I do not agree with it, is deliberately falsifying die results, right? You're like, well, I want this to be harder, so I'm going to roll the die, and I don't care what the die says. I'm going to say they've got a 19 on their attack roll. I don't agree with that, right? I just don't think that's valid. I think that it undermines trust between the players and the DM, and you really need a very trustful relationship. And really, the fundamental integrity of D&D is the integrity of the dice rolling. So if you are going to be rolling dice, I think you need to be very diligent in respecting the results of that dice roll. I'm not a big fan on rolling dice, to be honest with you, but if you are going to be, if you say I'm going to involve dice here, if I'm going to involve that random determination, then you need to be adhering to that, right? And it goes the other way too, right? If you're going to be pursuing that course of action and the results are negative in a way that you don't like them, it's like, oh, I really didn't want this NPC to hit this PC with this weapon attack. So instead of actually announcing that he rolls a 16 for a 22 to hit, I'm just going to say he rolls a 6 for a 10 to hit, right? Yeah, so I don't agree with that. In fact, I don't use a DM screen. I roll my dice in the open on the table for everyone to see. But that's more a matter of style. And there are many experienced DMs who I respect and enjoy playing with, who disagree with me on that point, who they see misreading the dice as a matter of DM prerogative that they have no problem implementing to scale the difficulty of encounters. But that's me. So to close, I guess we should talk a little bit about just the history of scaling of encounters. So if we go back to like Keep on the Borderlands and to AD&D in general, right? The first iteration of Dungeons and Dragons, scaling was not really part of the adventure of the published adventures, right? Published adventures, published content. You had fixed encounters, like and then you're like, if you had a party of 2 and you entered into this encounter that would be a piece of cake for a party of 6. Well, no, that was part of the fun and challenge of being a player, was figuring out how our PCs with just 2 in the party are going to overcome the challenge of this encounter. And that, it would definitely be easier. But even more broader than that, the idea that you would have a story where the number of opponents in an encounter was variable was suspicious, right? It's like, okay, why does this band of highwaymen in one instance have 10 members and in another instance has 3, depending upon how many PCs are playing here, right? That was viewed with suspicion. It was viewed as compromising the integrity of the story, in order for the mechanics of the game, right? And one of the goals of D&D was to make it much more about the story and not like a table game, not like a war game. Now that evolved over time, and by 3.5, scaling was 100% a part of the adventure design, right? So if you were publishing content, you were expected to in the encounter description describe modifications to the encounter that would account for parties of different levels, as well as parties of different sizes. And then that comes into fruition in 5th edition. My opinion on it is I like encounter scaling, right? Like I like the fact that with encounter scaling, I can have a party of 2 players, of 2 PCs at a particular level. They go through the encounter and they come out the other side with the same experience, with the same feelings and the same narrative point within the story as a party of 6 PCs at a different level, and they both come through that thinking, oh man, that was a hard one, or oh, that particular effect was weird, or whatever the element of the story building is there, that's not going to be dependent upon having a party that is very narrowly defined, that we can establish that plot point for a much wider number of PCs. Okay, so that's me on encounter design or encounter scaling. You may have completely different perspectives on it. You may completely disagree with me, and I would love to hear about that. I respond to, as far as I know, to every comment that's ever been made on any of these videos. So feel free to put down there what you think about encounter scaling. Even if you have additional questions that I haven't answered, that would be great too. Or if you have anecdotes or opinions that are going to validate what I've said, or have counterpoints, though all of those are fair game. Please do that. Please comment. The goal here is participation and conversation. And then, as I always say, I'm pretty recognizable in social media. I'm not hard to reach there on Facebook, Twitter, email, Reddit. Yeah, if you can catch me there, by all means, don't be shy. And if you find these videos helpful or informative, interesting, please hit that like button. That helps us to get seen by other people, by more people. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, this could be something I would want to see week in and week out, subscription is free. So until next week, thank you for tuning in.